The first time Jake Ross heard his stolen song sung by a stranger, it felt like watching someone else live his life better than he ever had. But when that stranger turned out to be a small-town diner waitress with a voice that could resurrect the dead, and eyes that saw straight through his famous facade, everything he thought he knew about music, love, and second chances was about to change forever. Picture this: Murphy's Bar on a rain-soaked Tuesday night in Cedar Falls, Georgia. Population 3,247, where everybody knows everybody and secrets last about as long as morning dew. The kind of place where dreams come to rest, not to soar. But on this particular evening, something extraordinary was happening in the corner of that cramped little venue with its mismatched chairs and beer-stained floor. A woman stood beneath the single spotlight, her dark skin glowing like burnished gold in the warm light. Her name was Keira Bailey, though most folks just called her the girl who could make angels weep with her singing. At 28, she'd spent the last 10 years serving coffee and comfort at Tessa's Diner, raising her teenage daughter Melody alone, and nursing dreams she'd convinced herself were too big for a small-town single mother. But when Keira opened her mouth and those first haunting notes of silent echoes filled the humid air, every conversation stopped. Every beer glass paused halfway to lips. Even the bartender forgot to pour. Her voice wrapped around the melody like silk around steel, turning a simple folk song into something transcendent. She sang about loss that felt like drowning, about memories that visited in the darkest hours, about learning to breathe again when the world felt airless. Her fingers moved across her acoustic guitar strings with reverence, each chord progression pulling her deeper into the emotion of the song. The small audience held their collective breath, sensing they were witnessing something sacred. What they didn't know, what Keira herself didn't know, was that the man who'd written those words was sitting in the shadows at the back of the room, his famous face hidden beneath a worn baseball cap and 3 days of stubble. Jake Ross hadn't set foot on a stage or picked up a guitar in 18 months. The multi-platinum singer-songwriter who'd once sold out stadiums now lived like a ghost in his Nashville penthouse, surrounded by gold records that felt like tombstones and instruments he couldn't bear to touch. His manager Manny called it a creative hiatus. His therapist called it depression. Jake called it penance. Because 18 months ago, his former best friend and collaborator Derek Walsh had done more than steal Jake's music. He'd stolen his ability to trust, to create, to believe that anything he made could be authentic in a world built on lies and betrayal. Silent Echoes had been Jake's most personal song, written in the raw aftermath of his father's sudden death, poured out in a single night of grief and longing. Derek had taken that sacred creation and butchered it, turning it into commercial drivel that topped the charts while Jake's heart shattered into pieces too small to glue back together. So when those familiar opening chords floated across the smoky air of Murphy's Bar, Jake's first instinct was rage. His hands clenched into fists under the scarred wooden table, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth. Someone else was performing his stolen song, his father's eulogy turned into entertainment. But then Keira's voice truly took flight, and something impossible happened. The anger transformed into wonder. She wasn't performing his song, she was healing it. Every note carried genuine pain, authentic loss, real hope. She sang like someone who understood that grief wasn't a mountain to climb over but an ocean to learn to swim in. She sang like someone who knew that the deepest wounds could become the source of the most beautiful music. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he watched her pour her soul into his words. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted back slightly, completely lost in the music. When she reached the chorus, the part Derek had ruined with overproduction and meaningless vocal runs, Keira's voice broke just slightly on the high note, not from lack of skill but from an overflow of emotion too big for any one voice to contain. The audience felt it too. A woman in the front row wiped tears from her cheeks. An older man nodded slowly, recognition flickering in his eyes, not of the song, but of the feeling it carried. This was what music was supposed to do. This was what Jake had forgotten in all the years of industry politics and manufactured hits. As the last note faded into reverent silence, Kira opened her eyes and smiled, a soft, grateful expression that made Jake's chest tighten with an emotion he'd forgotten how to name. The applause was warm but not overwhelming, the kind of appreciation that comes from a community supporting one of their own rather than worship of a celebrity. But when Kira's gaze swept across the small crowd and landed on Jake in his darkened corner, something electric passed between them. Her smile faltered just slightly, not in fear but in recognition of something she couldn't quite place. Those deep brown eyes seemed to see right through his disguise, past his fame, straight into the broken places he'd been hiding for too long. Jake found himself standing before he realized he'd decided to move, his legs carrying him through the maze of tables toward the small stage. The logical part of his brain screamed warnings, about exposure, about complications, about the impossibility of explaining how a small-town waitress had come to know his most personal song. But his heart was louder than his logic tonight, and his heart was singing for the first time in 18 months. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our diary of love. Where did you learn that song? Jake's voice was rougher than he'd intended, months of disuse evident in the gravelly tone that had once been as smooth as Tennessee whiskey. Kira set down her guitar carefully, her movements graceful even in her obvious uncertainty. Up close, Jake could see the faint lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and worry in equal measure, the calluses on her fingertips that matched his own, the way she held herself with the quiet strength of someone who'd learned to depend only on herself. She started, then stopped, studying his face with an intensity that made Jake feel exposed in ways that had nothing to do with recognition. My late husband left behind some sheet music. This was one of the songs. I've never heard it performed by anyone else. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Your late husband. The pieces began clicking into place with sickening clarity. Derek had been deployed overseas during his military service, back before his music career took off. He'd bragged about selling songs to fellow soldiers, making quick cash off melodies he claimed to have written himself. Jake's stolen song had somehow found its way to this woman through the worst kind of tragedy, the loss of the man she'd loved. What was his name? Jake asked softly, aware that conversations around them had died as locals began to recognize something unusual in this exchange. David Bailey. He was stationed in Afghanistan. Kira's voice carried the particular cadence of someone who'd learned to speak about loss without breaking apart. He loved music. Always said it was his way of carrying home with him. Jake's throat tightened. David Bailey. He didn't recognize the name, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that this woman had been loving his song, caring for it, giving it the tenderness it deserved while Jake had been hiding from it like a coward. He had good taste, Jake managed, the understatement feeling massive in his chest. Something flickered in Kira's expression, curiosity, maybe recognition. You seem familiar. Are you a musician? The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Jake could lie, could walk away, could preserve the careful isolation he'd built around his broken heart. Or he could take a step towards something that felt like possibility for the first time in too long. I used to be, he said instead, which was both completely true and entirely inadequate. The next morning found Jake sitting in a corner booth at Tessa's diner, nursing his third cup of coffee and pretending to read the local paper while actually watching Kira Bailey navigate the breakfast rush with the kind of effortless competence that comes from years of practice. She moved through the maze of tables like a dancer, coffee pot in one hand, order pad in the other, somehow managing to refill cups, take orders, and maintain friendly conversations with what seemed like half the town. Her smile was genuine with each customer, never rushed or forced, even when dealing with old Pete Morrison who always complained about his eggs and never tipped more than 50 cents. Jake had arrived when the diner opened at 6 a.m., partly because he was used to sleepless nights and partly because he couldn't stop thinking about the way Kira's voice had breathed life back into his deadest song. He'd told himself he just wanted coffee in a town where the hotel's breakfast was limited to stale pastries and burnt coffee. He'd told himself he wasn't specifically hoping to see her again. He'd told himself a lot of lies in the past 18 months. What was one more? But when Kira approached his table, order pad ready and professional smile in place, the careful fiction crumbled. The attraction he'd felt last night in the shadowy bar hit him like daylight, immediate, undeniable, and completely inappropriate given that she was working and he was essentially a stranger with secrets. "What can I get you, hon?" she asked, and Jake noticed the way her voice carried just a hint of the melody that had captivated him the night before. Even in casual conversation, she couldn't quite hide the music in her soul. "Just coffee," he said, then impulsively added, "and whatever you recommend for someone who hasn't had real food in about a week." That earned him a genuine smile, the kind that reached her eyes and made something warm unfurl in his chest. "Well, then. You're in for a treat. Tessa makes the best biscuits and gravy this side of Atlanta, and her hash browns are basically a religious experience. How does that sound?" "Perfect," Jake said, though he was looking at her face when he said it, noting the way morning light from the window caught the gold flecks in her brown eyes, how her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail that somehow managed to be elegant. As she turned to put in his order, Jake caught a glimpse of sheet music sticking out of her uniform pocket, handwritten lyrics in what looked like her careful script. The sight hit him with unexpected longing. When was the last time he'd carried unfinished songs with him, always ready to capture a new idea or refine an existing verse? When had he stopped believing that inspiration could strike anywhere, anytime? "You're not from around here," Kira said when she returned with his coffee, statement rather than question. "Nashville," Jake admitted, then added, "but I'm starting to think maybe I should visit small towns more often." "Oh, we're not that exciting." Kira refilled his cup even though he'd barely touched it, the gesture automatic. "Nothing ever happens in Cedar Falls." "Well, except for last night." "That was unusual." "Unusual how?" Jake asked, genuinely curious about her perspective on what had felt like a life-changing moment to him. "Open mic nights are usually pretty tame. Old Charlie singing his one Johnny Cash song, maybe a teenager with a guitar they just learned to play. But last night felt different. More." She paused, searching for the right word. "More real, I guess. Like the music actually meant something." Jake's chest tightened. She had no idea she was describing exactly what he'd been missing, that sense of music as communication, as connection, as something that mattered beyond chart positions and radio play. "Your song meant something," he said carefully. "The way you sang it, I mean. It was beautiful." Color rose in Kira's cheeks, and she glanced around the diner as if checking that no one was listening to what felt like an increasingly intimate conversation. "Thank you. That song, it's special to me. My husband used to hum it sometimes, before he deployed. I never knew where he learned it, but after she stopped, shook her head. Sorry, you don't need to hear all that." "I'd like to," Jake said, surprised by how much he meant it. "If you want to share." Something in his tone must have convinced her of his sincerity, because Kira's defensive posture softened slightly. David was always humming melodies, making up little songs. He said music was his way of staying connected to beauty when everything else felt ugly. When his belongings came home, there was this box of sheet music, some printed, some handwritten. Silent Echoes was in there. Jake's hands tightened around his coffee mug, but he kept his expression neutral. Did he write it himself? I don't think so. The handwriting wasn't his, and the style was more sophisticated than his usual compositions. But he must have loved it, to keep the sheet music with his personal things. Kira's voice grew soft. Sometimes I feel like singing his favorite songs is a way of keeping part of him alive. The words hit Jake like a revelation. She wasn't just performing a song, she was honoring a memory, keeping love alive through music. It was exactly what he'd intended when he'd written Silent Echoes in the aftermath of his father's death, exactly the kind of healing he'd hoped music could provide. "He sounds like he had a beautiful soul," Jake said quietly. "He did." Kira smiled, sadness and warmth intermingling in her expression. "He would have loved hearing you say that music used to be your calling. He always said musicians were the people brave enough to make their hearts public." I love hearing from our Dear Love Diaries family. Tell me in the comments, what's the most unexpected place you found a connection with someone? Your stories inspire these tales of love finding a way. Before Jake could respond, a teenage girl appeared at their table, backpack slung over one shoulder and expression caught between curiosity and protective suspicion. "Mom, Mrs. Henderson is here for her usual," the girl said, but her eyes were fixed on Jake with the keen assessment that only teenagers seem to master. "Of course, baby. Melody, this is..." Kira paused, realizing she'd never gotten Jake's name. "Jake," he supplied, extending a hand toward the teenager who was clearly Kira's daughter. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable, the same intelligent eyes, the same graceful way of holding herself, the same hint of music in her speaking voice. "Melody Bailey," she replied, shaking his hand with a firm grip that suggested she'd been taught to stand up for herself. "Are you the one everyone's talking about from last night?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "People are talking?" "Small town," Kira explained with a slight laugh. "Word gets around fast. Apparently, you made quite an impression, asking about the song." "Your mom has an incredible voice," Jake told Melody honestly. "That song last night was one of the most beautiful performances I've ever heard." Melody's suspicious expression softened just slightly. "She's been singing that one a lot lately. Usually only when she thinks I'm not listening, but the walls in our apartment are pretty thin." "Melody," Kira warned, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "What?" "It's true. You've been sadder than usual this month, and you always sing when you're working through something." Melody's attention turned back to Jake. "So what's your story? Mom doesn't usually get nervous around strangers." "I'm not nervous," Kira protested, but Jake noticed the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the unconscious gesture of someone who was very much aware of being watched. "Right," Melody said with the particular skepticism that only teenagers could achieve. "And I don't stay up past my curfew writing songs I pretend are homework assignments." Despite the awkwardness of the situation, Jake found himself smiling. There was something refreshing about Melody's directness, her obvious love for her mother combined with typical teenage embarrassment about parental behavior. "I'm just someone who appreciates good music," Jake said. "And your mom's performance last night reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place." It was perhaps more truth than he'd intended to share, but something about this family, their authenticity, their easy affection for each other, their complete lack of pretense, made honesty feel not just possible but necessary. Melody studied him for another moment, then seemed to reach some internal conclusion. "Okay, you can stay. But if you make my mom cry, I know where to hide bodies in this town." Melody. Kira's mortification was complete now, but Jake was laughing, the first genuine laugh he'd had in months. "I'll keep that in mind," he told Melody solemnly. "Though I should mention, my goal is definitely to make her smile, not cry." The words created a moment of suspended awareness among all three of them. Melody looked pleased, as if she'd successfully orchestrated something. Kira looked flustered but not displeased. And Jake felt something shift in his chest, some long-frozen part of himself beginning to thaw in the warmth of their family dynamic. "I better get Mrs. Henderson her coffee before she starts drumming her fingers on the table," Kira said, breaking the spell. "But Jake, thank you for what you said about the music. It means more than you know." As she walked away, Jake caught Melody watching him with the calculating expression of someone making important decisions. "She doesn't date," Melody said without preamble. "I'm sorry. My mom. She doesn't date. Hasn't since Dad died 4 years ago. Says she's too busy with work and raising me and doesn't need the complication." Melody hitched her backpack higher on her shoulder. "Just thought you should know, in case you were thinking about asking." Jake studied the teenager's face, seeing her mother's protective instincts combined with something else, hope, maybe, or longing for her mother to find happiness again. "What makes you think I was considering asking?" he said carefully. Melody rolled her eyes. "Please. You've been staring at her like she hung the moon since you walked in here. And she's been checking her reflection in the coffee pot every time she passes it, which she only does when she likes someone." She paused. "Plus, you're the first person to make her blush in about 3 years. That's got to count for something." Before Jake could formulate a response to that devastating assessment, Melody headed toward the door. "I'm late for school," she called over her shoulder. "But Jake? If you really do appreciate good music, you should ask her to sing for you again. She's always better when she has an audience who actually listens." And then she was gone, leaving Jake alone with his rapidly cooling coffee and the startling realization that he was already halfway to falling for a woman whose life was nothing like his own, and whose heart might just be exactly what his music, and his soul, had been missing all along. Chapter 2. 3 days later, Jake was still in Cedar Falls, telling himself he was just extending his impromptu road trip, that the change of scenery was good for his mental health, that he had no particular reason to keep returning to Tessa's diner for meals he could easily get delivered to his hotel room. He was lying to himself, of course. But after 18 months of brutal honesty about his failures and limitations, a little self-deception felt almost luxurious. The truth was, he couldn't stop thinking about Kira Bailey. Not just her voice, though that haunted him every time he closed his eyes. It was everything, the way she moved through her world with quiet confidence, how she treated every diner customer like family, the fierce love he'd witnessed in her interactions with Melody. She lived with an authenticity that Jake hadn't experienced in years of celebrity culture where everything was performance, everything was calculated for maximum impact. On Wednesday afternoon, he found himself walking through downtown Cedar Falls, all 3 blocks of it, with no particular destination in mind. The town had the worn comfort of a favorite sweater, buildings that had been standing since the 1940s, sidewalks cracked by decades of Georgia heat, storefronts that spoke of family businesses passed down through generations rather than corporate chains designed to maximize profit. He was passing Morrison's Hardware when a voice called out behind him. "You're the guy who's been asking about the Bailey girl." Jake turned to find a man about his own age emerging from beneath the hood of a pickup truck parked outside what appeared to be an auto repair shop. The stranger was tall and lean, with dark hair touched by premature gray at the temples and hands that spoke of years working with tools and engines. "I'm sorry," Jake said, though something about the man's face seemed familiar in a way that made his chest tighten with unpleasant recognition. "Kira Bailey. Heard you've been hanging around the diner, asking questions about her music." The man wiped his hands on a grease-stained rag, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. "Matt Ross. I own this place." The last name hit Jake like a physical blow. Ross. Which meant this was his brother, his younger brother who'd walked away from the music industry 6 years ago after a spectacular fight about Jake's priorities and what fame was doing to their family relationships. "Matt." Jake's voice came out rougher than he intended. "I didn't know you lived here." "Figured you didn't." Matt's expression was carefully neutral, but Jake could see the old hurt lurking beneath the surface. "Otherwise you probably would have avoided this particular small town." The brothers stood facing each other across the cracked sidewalk, 6 years of silence stretching between them like a chasm. Jake noticed that Matt looked good. Healthier than he had during his brief, disastrous stint as Jake's tour manager, more settled, more like the idealistic younger brother Jake remembered from childhood before fame complicated everything. "You look good," Jake said finally. "Happy." "I am happy." Matt's tone carried a challenge. "Found out there's more to life than chasing after people who don't want to be caught." The words stung because they were fair. Jake had chosen his career over his family more times than he could count, had missed birthdays and holidays and important moments because studio time or tour schedules or industry meetings always seemed more urgent than the people who loved him unconditionally. "Matt, save it," Matt interrupted, but not unkindly. "I didn't approach you to rehash old fights. I approached you because Kira Bailey is good people, and this town looks out for its own." Jake bristled slightly. "I'm not planning to hurt her." "Maybe not planning to," Matt conceded. "But you will. Because that's what you do, Jake. You show up, you charm everyone, you make them believe they matter to you, and then you leave when something shinier comes along." The accusation hit close enough to home to make Jake's temper flare. "You don't know anything about what I want or what I'm doing here. Don't I?" Matt stepped closer, and Jake could see their father's eyes in his brother's face. The same green eyes that had looked at Jake with such pride before disappointment slowly replaced it. "You're hiding out after another spectacular flameout, probably telling yourself you're taking a break to find yourself or some other celebrity bullshit. And you stumbled across a pretty girl with a pretty voice in a pretty little town where nobody knows your history, and now you're playing pretend that you're just a regular guy who could maybe make a regular life with someone real." Each word landed like a blow because Matt was describing exactly what Jake had been feeling without admitting it to himself. The fantasy of a simple life, a normal relationship, a world where his music mattered because it moved people rather than because it generated revenue. "But you're not a regular guy," Matt continued relentlessly. "You're Jake Ross, and your life is in Nashville, and when you get bored or scared or offered the right contract, you'll go back to that life and leave Kira to pick up the pieces. Just like you left me." The parallel was devastating because it was accurate. Jake had walked away from Matt when his brother questioned the direction of Jake's career, had chosen industry loyalty over family loyalty and convinced himself it was the mature, professional decision. "I was young," Jake said quietly. "I made mistakes." "Yeah, you did. And Kira doesn't deserve to become another one." Thunder rumbled overhead, interrupting their confrontation with the promise of the storm that had been building all afternoon. Gray clouds hung low and heavy, turning the air thick and oppressive with the kind of humidity that made clothes stick to skin and breathing feel like work. "Rain's coming," Matt observed, glancing up at the threatening sky. "Big one, by the look of it. You better head back to whatever fancy hotel you're staying at before this hits." But Jake found himself reluctant to end their conversation, even though every word was painful. This was the longest he'd spoken to his brother in 6 years, and despite the hostility, it felt important. Necessary. "The Comfort Inn isn't exactly fancy," Jake said. "And Matt, I know I screwed up. With you, with our family. I know I can't fix that with apologies." "No, you can't." Matt's expression softened slightly. "But maybe you can avoid screwing up someone else's life while you figure out what you actually want." The first fat raindrops began to fall, and Matt looked toward his garage with the practical concern of someone who had work to finish and tools to protect from the weather. "Look, I've got to close up before this storm hits." "But Jake." He paused, seeming to wrestle with himself. "Kira Bailey is the best person in this town. She's been through hell and come out stronger, and she's raising a kid who's going to change the world someday. She doesn't need some confused celebrity treating her like a vacation from his real life." Before Jake could respond, the skies opened up in the way that only southern storms could manage, a sudden, violent downpour that turned the world into a wall of water. Matt cursed and ran for his garage, and Jake found himself sprinting in the same direction, seeking shelter from the deluge. The garage was warm and dry and filled with the comfortable scents of motor oil and metal, old leather and sawdust. But what caught Jake's attention wasn't the automotive equipment, it was the corner that had been converted into something approaching a recording studio. Old amplifiers, a drum kit that had seen better days, guitars hanging on the wall like artifacts from another life. "You kept them," Jake said, recognizing some of the instruments from Matt's brief stint in the music business. "Couldn't bring myself to sell them." Matt grabbed a towel and began drying rain from his hair. "Don't play much anymore, but sometimes the local kids come by, want to learn a few chords. Kira brings melody sometimes, that girl's got her mother's musical gift, maybe more." The mention of Kira's daughter brought Jake's attention to a piece of sheet music on an old music stand. Even from across the room, he could see handwritten lyrics in what looked like a teenager's careful script. "She writes her own songs?" Jake asked. "Both of them do. Melody's got the technical training, she takes lessons online, studies music theory like it's scripture. But Kira..." Matt's expression grew thoughtful. "Kira writes from the soul. Never had formal training, but she understands music the way some people understand breathing." Lightning flashed outside, followed immediately by thunder that shook the building. The storm was directly overhead now, turning the afternoon dark as night. Jake realized they might be trapped here for a while, which meant an extended conversation with the brother who'd been avoiding him for 6 years. "I heard her sing," Jake said quietly. "She's extraordinary." "Yeah, she is. Which is why she deserves better than whatever game you're playing." Jake turned from the instruments to face his brother directly. "What if it's not a game? What if I'm exactly as lost as you think I am, and what if she's exactly what I need to find my way back to who I used to be?" Matt studied his face for a long moment, and Jake saw the exact moment when some of his brother's hostility shifted into concern. "Jake, what happened to you? I mean, really happened? Because you look like hell, and not just the kind of hell that comes from partying too hard or working too much." The question hung in the air between them, and Jake realized he was exhausted from carrying the weight of his professional disaster alone. For 18 months, he'd hidden the extent of Derek's betrayal, protected his former friend's reputation even while his own career crumbled. He'd let people think he was taking a voluntary break rather than admitting he'd been too broken to continue. "Derek stole my music," Jake said simply. "Not just the rights or the credit. He literally stole songs I'd written, passed them off as his own work. Including the most personal song I'd ever written about Dad's death." Matt's expression shifted from skepticism to shock to anger in rapid succession. "That bastard. Jake, why didn't you, what? Tell everyone my best friend and creative partner robbed me blind? Sue him publicly and turn the whole thing into a media circus? Destroy whatever was left of my ability to trust anyone in the industry?" Jake laughed bitterly. "I just shut down instead. Couldn't write, couldn't perform, couldn't even listen to music without wondering who was lying to me. And now?" Jake looked around the makeshift studio, thinking about Kira's voice breathing life back into his stolen song, about the way music had felt important again when she sang it. "Now I heard a woman sing one of those stolen songs like it was a prayer instead of a commodity, and I remembered why I started writing music in the first place." Thunder crashed again, and both brothers instinctively looked toward the garage door where rain was hammering against the metal with tropical intensity. "We're going to be here a while," Matt observed. "This kind of storm doesn't blow through quick." As if summoned by his words, a figure appeared in the doorway. Kira Bailey, soaked to the skin and slightly out of breath, her hair plastered to her head and her diner uniform clinging to her curves in ways that made Jake forget about storms and family reconciliation and everything except the fierce attraction that hit him like lightning every time he saw her. "Matt, I'm so sorry to bother you, but my car died in the parking lot across the street, and this storm," she stopped mid-sentence when she noticed Jake standing by the instruments. "Oh. Hi." "Hi," Jake managed, trying not to stare at the way her soaked uniform revealed the graceful lines of her body, the way water dripped from her dark hair onto her shoulders. "Let me get you a towel," Matt said, the practical brother taking charge. "And we'll take a look at your car once this passes. Probably just the alternator. I've been telling you that thing was about to give up for months." Kira accepted the towel gratefully, wrapping it around her shoulders while water continued to drip from her clothes onto the concrete floor. "I was supposed to pick up Melody from her study group, but now I'm stranded, and she's going to think something happened. I can call her," Matt offered. "Let her know you're safe and that we'll figure out transportation once the storm passes." But Jake was barely listening to the practical conversation because something else was happening. Being trapped in this intimate space with Kira, watching her unconscious grace as she tried to wring water from her hair, seeing her genuine concern for her daughter, it was stripping away the last of his carefully maintained emotional distance. This wasn't just attraction anymore. This was the kind of devastating awareness that preceded either great happiness or great heartbreak, and Jake was terrified to discover which one awaited him. "Actually," Kira said, her gaze moving between the two brothers with growing curiosity, "I should probably ask, how do you two know each other?" Matt and Jake exchanged a look that carried 6 years of complicated history. "Jake's my brother," Matt said simply. "Though we're still working out whether that's a good thing or a bad thing." Kira's eyes widened as she processed this information, her gaze moving to Jake with new understanding. "Your brother? The one who?" "The one who chose his career over his family," Matt finished. "The one who hasn't spoken to me in 6 years until today." Jake flinched at the blunt summary, but he couldn't argue with its accuracy. "I'm sorry," Kira said quietly. "I didn't mean to intrude on a family conversation." "You're not intruding," Jake said quickly. "And Matt's right, I did choose my career over family. But I'm hoping to figure out how to do better." Another flash of lightning illuminated the garage, and in that brief, stark light, Jake saw something shift in Kira's expression. Understanding, maybe, or recognition of the kind of regret that came from putting the wrong things first. "Family's complicated," she said softly. "Sometimes the people we love the most are the easiest ones to hurt." "Speaking from experience?" Jake asked. "I missed my father's last Christmas because I was working double shifts to save money for Melody's college fund," Kira admitted. "Told myself I'd make it up to him, that he'd understand why providing for the future was more important than taking one day off. He died 2 weeks later." The confession hung in the air, raw and honest and painful. Jake saw his own guilt reflected in her eyes. The terrible weight of choices that couldn't be unmade, love that had been expressed through sacrifice rather than presence. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it completely. He did understand, Kira continued. "That's what made it worse, somehow. He was proud of how hard I worked, how much I prioritized Melody's needs. But I would give anything to have that Christmas back, to have chosen differently." Matt was watching this exchange with interest, as if seeing both his brother and his friend in a new light. "Maybe that's why the song matters so much to you," Jake said carefully. "The one you performed the other night. It's about loss, about wishing we could have said the things that mattered while we still had time." "Yes," Kira whispered. "Exactly. How did you?" She stopped, studying his face with the kind of intensity that made Jake feel transparent. "You understand it. The music, I mean. Most people hear a pretty melody and nice words, but you understand what it really means." Jake's chest tightened with the temptation to tell her everything, that he'd written the song she loved, that her interpretation had saved it from Derek's commercial bastardization, that listening to her sing had been the first time in 18 months that music felt like healing instead of heartbreak. But before he could find the words, Kira was moving toward the instruments in the corner, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had always existed between musicians and their tools. "Matt, do you mind if I?" She gestured toward an acoustic guitar hanging on the wall. "Course not. You know you're always welcome to play here." Kira lifted the guitar with the reverence of someone who understood the sacred relationship between musician and instrument. She settled onto a stool, positioning the guitar across her lap with practiced ease, her fingers automatically finding the frets as if they belonged there. "I've been working on something new," she said, almost to herself. "Something about storms, about finding shelter in unexpected places." And then she began to play. The melody was simple but haunting, her voice soft and sweet as honey poured over gravel. She sang about rain washing the world clean, about strangers becoming shelter, about how sometimes the things that trapped you also set you free. Her eyes were closed, lost in the music, and Jake found himself holding his breath as he watched her transform from a practical small-town waitress into something ethereal, something divine. This was what he'd been missing. Not just technical skill or commercial appeal, but this. The alchemy that happened when someone poured their soul into sound, when music became a bridge between hearts, when performance transcended entertainment and became communication of the deepest kind. When the last note faded, the silence in the garage felt sacred. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside this makeshift studio, something precious had been created. "That was beautiful," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't hide. "It's not finished," Kira said, setting the guitar aside. "I can hear how it should sound, but I don't have the technical knowledge to make it happen." "What do you hear?" Jake asked, moving closer without thinking about it. "Harmony, mainly. A second voice weaving around the melody, creating depth. And maybe strings, violin or fiddle, something that speaks to the folk roots but elevates them." She looked up at him, vulnerability clear in her dark eyes. "I know it sounds silly, getting so specific about arrangements when I can barely play 3 chords." "It doesn't sound silly," Jake said. "It sounds like you have real musical instincts. Have you ever thought about collaborating with someone who could help you realize those arrangements?" The suggestion hung between them, innocent on the surface but charged with deeper implications. Matt was watching this exchange with growing understanding, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally clicking into place. "I wouldn't know where to find someone like that," Kira said softly. "And besides, who would want to work with a small-town amateur? Someone who recognizes that technical skill without heart is just noise," Jake said. "Someone who understands that the best music comes from authentic emotion, not perfect execution." Their eyes met and held, and Jake felt the same electric awareness that had struck him at Murphy's bar, magnified by the intimacy of the stormy afternoon and the vulnerable honesty of shared confessions. "Jake," Kira said quietly, "who are you, really?" The question was both simple and impossible. Who was he? A failed superstar hiding from his former life? A broken man trying to find his way back to authenticity? Someone who might be falling in love with a woman whose world was nothing like his own? Before he could attempt an answer, lightning struck close enough to shake the building, and the lights in the garage flickered and died, plunging them into the gray twilight of the storm. "Well," Matt said into the sudden darkness, "looks like we're here for the duration." But Jake was thinking that being trapped in the dark with Kira Bailey, surrounded by instruments and the lingering magic of her music, might be exactly where he was supposed to be. For the first time in 18 months, he didn't want to be anywhere else in the world. Chapter 3. In the sudden darkness of the garage, Jake could hear everything with startling clarity: the drum of rain on the metal roof, Matt moving around to find emergency lighting, the soft sound of Kira's breathing just a few feet away. But most of all, he was aware of the electric tension that had been building between them all afternoon, now intensified by the intimate darkness. "There should be a flashlight somewhere," Matt's voice came from across the garage, followed by the sound of him rummaging through tool drawers. "I'm okay," Kira said softly, though Jake could hear the slight tremor in her voice that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. "The storm should pass soon." "Actually," Matt said, and Jake caught the note of concern in his brother's tone, "this is looking like it might be one of those all-night affairs." The radio was predicting severe weather through morning. Jake heard Kira's sharp intake of breath. "Melody. She'll be worried sick if I don't come home tonight. I'll call her again, Matt offered. Let her know you're safe and staying with friends until the roads are clear. In the darkness, Jake found himself moving closer to where Kira sat, drawn by an instinct he couldn't name. Are you cold? He asked, noting the way she'd pulled the towel tighter around her shoulders. A little, she admitted. The temperature dropped when the power went out. Without thinking, Jake shrugged out of his jacket and reached toward her in the darkness, his hands gently settling the warm fabric around her shoulders. The simple gesture brought him close enough to breathe in the scent of her hair, something floral and clean that made his chest tighten with longing. Thank you, Kira whispered, and Jake realized their faces were only inches apart in the darkness. He could feel the warmth of her breath, could sense rather than see the way she was looking up at him. Found it, Matt announced, and suddenly a beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating Jake and Kira in their intimate tableau, him leaning over her protective and close, her looking up at him with an expression of wonder and awareness that made Jake's breath catch. For a moment, all three of them froze in the sudden light. Then Kira pulled back slightly, color rising in her cheeks, and Jake straightened with the guilty awareness of someone caught in a moment more revealing than intended. Sorry, Matt said, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all. Didn't mean to interrupt. You weren't interrupting anything, Kira said quickly, but Jake noticed she didn't remove his jacket. Matt set up the battery-powered lantern on a workbench, casting soft, warm light throughout the garage. The intimate atmosphere didn't dissipate with the return of visibility. If anything, the golden glow made everything feel more romantic, more charged with possibility. So, Matt said, settling onto a stool across from them, looks like we're having a sleepover. Might as well make the best of it. Jake could see his brother's strategy, forced proximity, emotional honesty facilitated by unusual circumstances, the kind of situation where truths had a way of revealing themselves. It was manipulative and obvious and exactly what Jake needed, even if it terrified him. I should probably call my daughter, Kira said, pulling out her phone. Let her know what's happening. Jake listened to the one-sided conversation, noting the easy affection in Kira's voice as she reassured Melody about her safety, promised to be home as soon as the roads were passable, reminded her about homework and curfew. It was such a normal, maternal exchange, but it highlighted the vast differences between their lives, Kira's grounded in responsibility and routine, his adrift in a world where plans could change on a whim and the only person he was accountable to was himself. She's staying at her friend's house tonight, Kira reported after hanging up. Probably planning to stay up all night gossiping and eating junk food. Sounds like a perfect teenage sleepover, Matt said. Remember when we used to do that, Jake? Before you got too cool for hanging out with your little brother. The comment was light, teasing, but Jake heard the old hurt underneath. I was never too cool for you, Matt. I was just lost, I guess. Caught up in things that seemed important but weren't. What kinds of things? Kira asked softly, genuine curiosity in her voice. Jake considered how to answer that without revealing too much. The music industry can be consuming. There's always another song to write, another studio session, another meeting with people who want to change your sound or your image or your entire artistic vision. After a while, you forget why you started making music in the first place. Why did you start? Kira asked. The question hit Jake like a physical blow, not because it was difficult but because the answer came so easily, so immediately, that he realized he'd never really lost sight of it. He'd just buried it under years of commercial considerations and industry politics. Because music was the only way I could say things that were too big for regular words, Jake said quietly. Because when I played guitar, the world made sense in a way it never did otherwise. Because I thought maybe if I could write the perfect song, I could help other people feel less alone. In the soft lantern light, Jake saw something shift in Kira's expression. Recognition, understanding, the kind of connection that happened when someone recognized their own truth reflected in another person's words. Yes, she whispered. That's exactly, yes. Is that why you sing? Jake asked. I sing because I have to, Kira said simply. Because there are feelings that don't fit anywhere else, stories that need to be told, moments that deserve to be remembered in melody. Even when no one's listening, even when it's just me and the morning prep at the diner, I sing because it's how I make sense of everything else. Jake felt something crack open in his chest, some carefully guarded place that had been protecting itself from exactly this kind of recognition. She understood. Not just music, but the compulsion to create, the need to transform experience into art, the way songs could carry emotions too complex for any other form of expression. You know what you two need to do, Matt said suddenly, startling them both out of their intense mutual focus. What? Kira asked. Write something together. Right now, while you're both stuck here and being honest about why music matters. Matt gestured toward the instruments. You've got guitars, you've got time, you've got shared inspiration. What are you waiting for? Jake's first instinct was to resist. He hadn't written anything new in 18 months, had convinced himself that his creative well had permanently run dry. But looking at Kira in the warm light, seeing the spark of possibility in her eyes, he felt something stir that might have been hope. I don't know, Kira said hesitantly. I mean, I write little things, but nothing serious. Nothing that someone with real training would want to collaborate on. What if, Jake said carefully, we didn't worry about whether it was serious or professional? What if we just played around? Saw what happened when your instincts met with some technical knowledge. The suggestion hung between them, innocent on the surface but charged with deeper implications. This wasn't just about writing a song, it was about opening themselves to creative vulnerability, to the possibility that together they might create something neither could achieve alone. Okay, Kira said softly. What did you have in mind? Jake stood and moved toward the guitars on the wall, selecting one that looked well-maintained and properly tuned. As his fingers found the familiar weight and shape of the instrument, he felt something long-dormant awakening in his hands. Tell me about that song you were working on, he said, settling back onto a stool facing Kira. The one about storms and shelter. It's just fragments, really. Kira accepted the second guitar Matt handed her. Impressions more than a complete song. Start with the impressions. Sometimes the best songs come from pieces that fit together in unexpected ways. As Kira began to play the melody she'd shared earlier, Jake listened with the focused attention he'd once brought to every creative collaboration. But this felt different from working with Derek or other industry professionals. There was no agenda here, no commercial considerations or label expectations. This was pure creativity, music for its own sake, art born from authentic emotion rather than market research. What if, Jake said, his fingers finding harmony chords to complement her melody, the storm isn't just weather? What if it's everything that disrupts our plans, forces us to find shelter in places we never expected? Like meeting someone who changes everything you thought you knew about your life? Kira asked, her eyes meeting his over their guitars. Exactly like that. They played together for several minutes, Jake adding complexity to her simple chord progression while she experimented with vocal harmony over his instrumental additions. The music that emerged was unlike anything Jake had created before, rootsy and authentic, technically sophisticated but emotionally direct, the kind of song that felt both timeless and completely contemporary. There's something here, Jake said quietly when they paused. Something real. I can feel it too, Kira admitted. But I don't know how to. She gestured helplessly at her guitar. I can hear what it should sound like, but I don't have the skills to make it happen. What do you hear? A bridge that builds to something bigger. Maybe a key change that lifts the whole song into something transcendent. And I keep imagining how it would sound with a full arrangement. Fiddle, maybe some percussion, harmony vocals that turn the chorus into an anthem. Jake stared at her, amazed by the sophisticated musical vision coming from someone with no formal training. She was describing exactly the kind of arrangement that would take the song from good to extraordinary, the kind of production instincts that usually came from years of studio experience. "That's exactly right," he said. "You have incredible musical intuition, Kira. With some technical guidance, you could." "Could what?" she interrupted, self-doubt creeping into her voice. "Become some kind of professional musician?" "Jake, I'm a single mother in a town where the biggest musical venue is Murphy's Bar. I serve coffee and save tips and dream about maybe buying Melody a better guitar for Christmas. I'm not cut out for anything bigger than that." "Why not?" Jake asked, and the question surprised them both with its intensity. "Because that's not my life," Kira said simply. "Because people like me don't get those kinds of opportunities. Because even if I could somehow develop the skills, I wouldn't know the first thing about the music industry or how to navigate it without getting taken advantage of." "What if you didn't have to navigate it alone?" Jake heard himself saying. "What if someone who understood both the creative and business sides could help you develop your talent while protecting your integrity?" The garage fell silent except for the continuing drumbeat of rain overhead. Matt was watching this exchange with growing understanding, as if he could see exactly where it was heading. Kira was staring at Jake with an expression caught between hope and disbelief. "Are you offering to help me?" she asked quietly. Jake realized he was. More than that, he was offering something he'd never given anyone before. True creative partnership, the kind of collaboration that put artistic vision ahead of commercial considerations. "I'm saying that what we just created together is the most authentic music I've been part of in years," Jake said. "I'm saying that your voice, your songwriting instincts, your emotional honesty, those are exactly what the music world needs more of. And I'm saying that if you wanted to explore what you could accomplish with some guidance and support, I'd consider it an honor to be part of that journey." "Jake," Matt said quietly, a warning in his voice. "Think about what you're saying." But Jake was thinking, maybe for the first time in years. He was thinking about how Kira's voice had brought his stolen song back to life, how their impromptu collaboration had reminded him why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place, how being around her made him feel like the person he'd been before fame complicated everything. "I am thinking," Jake said, his eyes never leaving Kira's face. "I'm thinking that I've spent 18 months convinced I'd never create anything meaningful again, and 20 minutes with you has changed that completely." Thunder crashed overhead, so close and so loud that all three of them instinctively looked up. But when the sound faded, Jake realized something fundamental had shifted in the small, lamplit garage. The storm outside was just weather, but the storm building between him and Kira was something else entirely. Dangerous and necessary and potentially life-changing. "I don't understand," Kira said softly. "You're a professional musician. You could collaborate with anyone you wanted. Why would you want to work with someone like me?" "Because," Jake said, setting aside his guitar and moving closer to her, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, close enough to catch the slight tremor in her breathing, "everyone else I've ever worked with wanted to change me, to mold my music into something more marketable or radio-friendly or commercially viable. But you make me want to be more myself, not less." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Jake could see the exact moment when Kira's professional curiosity transformed into something more personal, more dangerous. "Jake," she whispered, his name a prayer or a warning or both. And then, as if drawn by forces beyond their control, they were moving toward each other. Jake's hand came up to cradle her face, his thumb tracing the delicate curve of her cheekbone. Kira's eyes fluttered closed, her lips parting slightly in anticipation. The kiss, when it finally happened, was everything Jake had been afraid to hope for. Soft and sweet at first, then deeper as Kira's hands fisted in his shirt and pulled him closer. She tasted like hope and possibility, like everything he'd been missing without knowing he was missing it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jake rested his forehead against hers and tried to process what had just happened. The attraction he'd felt from the beginning had exploded into something much more complex: desire, yes, but also recognition, the sense of finding something he hadn't even known he was looking for. "Well," Matt said from across the garage, and Jake had completely forgotten his brother was there. "I guess that answers some questions." Kira pulled back with a gasp, color flooding her cheeks as she realized they'd had an audience for their moment of connection. "Oh God. I'm so sorry." "I don't usually, that is, I never, don't apologize," Jake said quickly, his hand still resting on her face. "Please don't apologize for that." "But Kira stumbled over the words, clearly overwhelmed by the intensity of what had just passed between them. "Kira," Jake said gently, "look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, and Jake saw vulnerability there, confusion, desire, and something that might have been fear. "This is new for me too," he said quietly. "Whatever this is, whatever's happening between us, I've never felt anything like it before." "What are we doing?" Kira asked, the question barely audible over the storm outside. "I don't know," Jake admitted. "But I know I don't want to stop." Matt cleared his throat diplomatically. "Maybe I should check on something in the other room. Give you two a chance to talk privately." "Matt, you don't have to," Jake started. "Yeah, I do," his brother said, standing and gathering the flashlight. "But Jake? Whatever happens here, whatever you decide you want, just remember what I said about Kira deserving better than becoming another one of your mistakes." After Matt disappeared into the darkness of the office area, Jake and Kira sat in the soft lamplight, the weight of possibility and complication heavy between them. "He's right, you know," Kira said finally. "About me deserving better. Not because I'm too good for you, but because I can't afford to make mistakes. I have Melody to think about, responsibilities that don't allow for impulsive decisions." "This doesn't feel impulsive," Jake said. "This feels like the first real thing that's happened to me in years." "Maybe that's the problem," Kira said softly. "You're looking for real, and I'm just a small-town waitress who sings in bars. What happens when you realize I'm not as interesting as you thought? What happens when you miss your old life and decide this was just a phase?" The questions were fair and devastating because they touched on Jake's deepest fears about himself, that he was too damaged by fame to sustain authentic relationships, that he would inevitably choose career over connection just as he always had before. "I can't promise I won't mess this up," Jake said honestly. "I can't promise I know how to be in a real relationship with someone who matters this much. But I can promise that what I feel when I'm with you isn't a phase or a vacation from my real life. This feels more real than anything else has in years." Outside, lightning flashed again, illuminating the windows of the garage in stark relief. But inside their small circle of lamplight, Jake and Kira sat suspended between fear and hope, between the safety of their separate lives and the terrifying possibility of something beautiful and complicated and transformative. "If we did this," Kira said carefully, "if we tried to see where this goes, what would that look like? I mean practically. Your life is in Nashville, your career is waiting for you to come back to it. My life is here, rooted in community and family and obligations I can't just abandon." "I don't know," Jake admitted. "But maybe that's what we figure out together. Maybe the point isn't to have all the answers right now, maybe the point is to stop being afraid of the questions." Thunder rumbled overhead, but softer now, the storm beginning to move past them toward other small towns, other unexpected encounters. In its wake, it left a changed landscape, trees down, roads flooded, power lines damaged, the comfortable predictability of daily life temporarily disrupted. But in the warm shelter of Matt's garage, surrounded by instruments and possibilities, Jake Ross and Kira Bailey had found something worth the risk of disruption. They'd found each other, and for the first time in either of their lives, that felt like enough to build a future on, uncertain and complicated and absolutely necessary. As the night stretched ahead of them, full of conversation and tentative planning and the gradual recognition that their lives had just become inextricably intertwined. Neither of them could have predicted how much more beautiful and painful their story was about to become. But they could feel it beginning, their perfect harmony, fragile and powerful and completely real. Chapter 4. The next 3 weeks passed like a dream that Jake wasn't sure he wanted to wake up from. Cedar Falls had somehow become home in a way that Nashville, for all its industry connections and professional opportunities, had never managed to be. Every morning, he found himself at Tessa's diner before the breakfast rush, ostensibly for coffee but really for the chance to watch Kira move through her world with that particular grace that made ordinary moments feel extraordinary. She'd started saving him a corner booth, the one with the best view of the kitchen where she worked, where he could catch glimpses of her singing softly to herself while she prepped vegetables or assembled orders. Their relationship had developed with the natural progression of water finding its level. After that stormy night in Matt's garage, they'd both acknowledged that something profound had shifted between them, but they'd approached it with the careful consideration of two people who understood that the best things in life were worth protecting. Jake had officially extended his stay in Cedar Falls indefinitely, much to his manager Manny's growing frustration. The phone calls from Nashville were becoming more frequent and more urgent, but Jake found himself caring less about industry obligations with each passing day. For the first time in his adult life, he was living in the present instead of constantly chasing the next career milestone. Most evenings found him at Kira's small apartment above the hardware store, a cozy space that reflected her practical nature and artistic soul in equal measure. The living room walls were lined with Melody's school photos and art projects, Kira's handwritten lyrics tucked between recipes and grocery lists on the refrigerator, an old piano that had belonged to her grandmother taking up entirely too much space in the tiny dining area. It was there, in that warm domestic space, that Jake began to understand what he'd been missing in his years of celebrity isolation. This was what real life looked like. Messy and immediate and grounded in relationships that mattered more than any professional achievement. "You don't have to help with that," Kira said one Thursday evening, finding Jake elbow-deep in dishwater while she finished wiping down counters after dinner. "You're a guest." "I'm not a guest anymore," Jake replied, rinsing a plate with the careful attention of someone who'd never had to do his own housework until recently. What am I exactly?" Kira paused in her cleaning, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. They'd been spending their days together, sharing meals and conversations and tentative kisses that left them both wanting more, but they'd been careful not to rush toward definitions that might complicate what was still a fragile connection. "You're the man who taught my daughter how to play Blackbird last weekend," Kira said finally. "You're the person who listens to my half-finished songs like they matter. You're whoever you want to be here, Jake. No pressure, no expectations beyond treating us with kindness." The simple honesty of her answer hit Jake like a revelation. When was the last time someone had offered him acceptance without agenda, space to exist without performance? Even his closest industry relationships had been built on mutual benefit rather than genuine affection. "I want to be someone worthy of what you're offering," Jake said quietly. "You already are," Kira replied, moving to stand beside him at the sink. "The question is whether you believe it." Before Jake could respond, Melody appeared in the kitchen doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder and guitar case in hand. "Mom, I'm heading to Sarah's house to work on our duet for the school talent show. We'll be back by 9. She paused, studying Jake with the assessing gaze that had become familiar over the past weeks. "Jake, do you want to hear what we've been working on? It's an arrangement of one of the songs you and Mom wrote together." Jake's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You've been performing our music?" "Just the bridge from Shelter in the Storm," Melody said with a slight blush. "But we added a harmony part that I think you'll like. Sarah has this incredible high voice that complements mine really well." "I'd love to hear it," Jake said, drying his hands on a dish towel. "But first, can I ask you something?" "Sure. How do you feel about me being here so much? I mean, really." It's okay if you're not comfortable with it, this is your home, your space with your mom. Melody set down her guitar case and considered the question with the careful thoughtfulness that Jake had learned was characteristic of her approach to everything important. At first, I thought you were just some rich guy slumming it in small-town life until you got bored, she said with typical teenage directness. But you're not, are you? You actually care about this place, about the people here. About us. More than I've cared about anything in a very long time, Jake admitted. Good. Because Mom deserves someone who sees how amazing she is. And if you hurt her, I meant what I said about knowing where to hide bodies. Melody. Kira protested, but she was laughing. What? It's important to establish clear expectations in any relationship. Melody shouldered her backpack. But Jake, I like having you around. You make Mom sing more, and she's been happier these past few weeks than I've seen her since Dad died. So thank you for that. After Melody left for her friend's house, Jake and Kira found themselves alone in the comfortable quiet of evening settling over the small apartment. These had become Jake's favorite moments, the domestic intimacy of shared space and easy silence, the gradual relaxation that came when public personas could be set aside. She's incredible, Jake said, settling onto the couch beside Kira. Melody, I mean. You've raised an extraordinary young woman. She raised herself, mostly, Kira replied with characteristic self-deprecation. I just tried to keep her fed and housed and loved while she figured out who she wanted to become. Don't do that, Jake said gently. Don't minimize what you've accomplished. Single parenthood is hard enough without adding humility that borders on self-denial. Kira looked at him with surprise. How would you know about single parenthood? I don't, directly. But I know what it looks like when someone puts everyone else's needs before their own, and I know the strength it takes to build a life focused on someone else's happiness. Jake reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. I also know that Melody's confidence, her kindness, her musical talent, those didn't happen by accident. They happened because she had a mother who believed in her potential and sacrificed to nurture it. Kira's eyes filled with unexpected tears. I just worry that I'm not enough. That I can't give her all the opportunities she deserves, that my limitations are holding her back. What if that's not your job? Jake asked softly. What if your job isn't to be everything to her, but to love her enough to help her become everything to herself? The question seemed to unlock something in Kira's careful composure. She turned toward Jake on the couch, studying his face with the intensity that always made him feel both exposed and understood. How do you do that? She asked. How do you say exactly what I need to hear, even when I didn't know I needed to hear it? Maybe because I recognize the fear, Jake admitted. I spent years terrified that I wasn't enough, for my fans, for my label, for anyone who believed in my music. It took me way too long to realize that being enough isn't about perfection. It's about authenticity. Is that what you're doing here? Being authentic? I'm trying to, Jake said. For the first time in my adult life, I'm trying to just be myself instead of being what I think people need me to be. Kira leaned closer, her free hand coming up to trace the line of his jaw. And who are you, when you're just being yourself? The question hung between them, intimate and challenging. In the soft lamplight of her small living room, with her daughter's art on the walls and the smell of dinner still lingering in the air, Jake felt more himself than he had in years. I'm someone who wants to build a life that matters beyond industry success, he said quietly. Someone who's tired of performing relationships instead of living them. Someone who's falling in love with a woman who makes him remember why music was important in the first place. The confession hung in the air between them, more definitive than anything either of them had said before. Kira's breath caught, her eyes searching his face for any sign that the words were casual or premature. Jake, she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like music. Too much? He asked, suddenly uncertain. Too soon? No, Kira said firmly. Not too much. Not too soon. Just perfect timing. When she kissed him this time, it was different from their first kiss in the storm-darkened garage. This was deliberate, intentional, the kiss of someone who had made a decision rather than been swept away by circumstance. Her hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and Jake felt every carefully maintained wall around his heart finally crumble completely. They might have continued in that direction. Toward the bedroom, toward the kind of intimacy that would change everything irrevocably, but the sound of Jake's phone ringing broke through their absorption in each other. Ignore it, Kira murmured against his lips. Gladly, Jake agreed, but the phone kept ringing with the particular persistence that suggested an emergency or at least something that wouldn't be easily dismissed. With a reluctant sigh, Jake pulled back and checked the caller ID. Manny Sinclair. His manager, calling for the third time that day. I should probably take this, Jake said apologetically. He's been trying to reach me all week, and if I don't answer, he's likely to show up here in person. Kira nodded, though Jake could see the disappointment in her eyes at the intrusion of his other life into their carefully protected bubble. Jake, thank God, Manny's voice was tight with stress when Jake answered. Where the hell are you? I've been calling for days. I told you, I'm taking some personal time. Personal time is over, Manny interrupted. We have a situation. A big one. Derek Walsh is claiming you stole material from him for that album 3 years ago. He's filed a lawsuit and gone to the press. Your name is being dragged through every music blog and gossip site on the internet. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. Derek was attacking him publicly, turning their private betrayal into a media circus designed to destroy what remained of Jake's reputation. That's ridiculous, Jake said, aware that Kira was watching his expression with growing concern. He's the one who stole my music. I have documentation that's been sealed in lawyers' offices for 18 months while you disappeared, Manny said bluntly. Meanwhile, Derek's been spinning a story about you stealing his songs and then hiding when confronted. The industry is starting to believe him, Jake. You need to get back to Nashville immediately and deal with this before it destroys your career completely. My career is already destroyed, Jake said quietly. That's why I left. No, it was damaged. There's a difference. But if you don't fight this publicly, if you don't return calls and take meetings and remind people why they fell in love with your music in the first place, then it really will be over. Jake looked at Kira, seeing his own conflict reflected in her eyes. She understood, without needing explanation, that this phone call was about to shatter the careful world they'd been building together. How long do I have? Jake asked. You should have been here yesterday, Manny said. But if you leave immediately, we might be able to salvage this. There's a label meeting tomorrow afternoon, and Gloria Ramirez specifically requested you be there. Apparently, she has some ideas about image rehabilitation that could work in your favor. Jake closed his eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices. Return to Nashville and fight for a career that had brought him nothing but isolation and betrayal, or stay in Cedar Falls and protect the first real happiness he'd found in years while watching his professional life implode from a distance. Jake? Manny's voice cut through his internal struggle. What's it going to be? Before Jake could answer, Kira reached for his free hand, squeezing gently. When he opened his eyes, she was looking at him with an expression of gentle determination. Go, she said softly. What? Go to Nashville. Handle whatever needs to be handled. Fight for your reputation and your music. Kira's voice was steady, but Jake could see the cost of those words in her eyes. You can't build something real on the foundation of running away from something else. Kira, I don't want to leave, I know. But this is your life, your career, your artistic legacy. You can't abandon it without fighting, or you'll always wonder what might have been. She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Besides, we'll still be here when you get back. The simple faith in those words, the assumption that he would come back, that what they'd built was strong enough to survive separation and industry pressure, hit Jake like a physical blow. "Jake?" Manny's voice came through the phone. "I need an answer." Jake looked at Kira for another long moment, seeing strength and love and the kind of selfless support that made him understand why good men wrote songs about heartbreak and devotion. "I'll be there tomorrow," Jake told his manager. "Set up whatever meetings you think are necessary." After hanging up, Jake and Kira sat in the sudden quiet of her living room, both processing what had just changed between them. "How long will you be gone?" Kira asked finally. "I don't know," Jake admitted. "It depends on how complicated this gets, how much damage Derek has done, whether the industry is willing to listen to my side of the story. And if they're not? If Derek's version becomes the accepted truth?" Jake considered the question seriously. "Then I guess I'll have to decide what matters more, clearing my name or building a new life that doesn't depend on industry validation." "That's not a choice you should have to make," Kira said firmly. "What Derek did to you was wrong, and you deserve the chance to set the record straight. What if setting the record straight means months of legal battles and media attention and all the industry politics I've been trying to escape? What if fighting for my old life means sacrificing what we found here?" Kira was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could see her wrestling with the same impossible calculations that were tearing him apart. "Then we'll figure it out," she said finally. "Together. Because whatever happens in Nashville, whatever you decide about your career, I'm not going anywhere." This, she gestured between them, encompassing the couch where they sat, the apartment around them, the life they'd been building, this is real. And real things survive challenges. Jake pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair and breathing in the scent that had become synonymous with home. Tomorrow, he would return to a world of lawyers and label executives and publicity strategies. He would fight for his reputation and his artistic integrity and the right to control his own narrative. But tonight, he held the woman who had given him back his voice and promised to wait while he figured out how to use it. Tonight, he memorized the feeling of being loved for exactly who he was, not who he could become or what he could achieve. This is the moment that changes everything for Jake and Kira, and I know many of you have faced impossible choices between love and dreams. Tell me in the comments about a time when you had to choose between your heart and your ambitions. How did you decide? Your experiences help shape these stories. And as the night deepened around them, Jake Ross began to understand that the real test of his transformation wouldn't be whether he could walk away from his old life, but whether he could navigate it without losing the new man he'd become in the process. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect southern day that made leaving feel like betrayal. Jake packed his few belongings with mechanical efficiency, each item placed in his suitcase feeling like another step away from the life that had started to feel possible. Kira had insisted on making him breakfast, and they ate in careful conversation about practical things, flight times and phone calls and when they might see each other again. But underneath the logistics, Jake could feel the weight of everything unsaid, all the fears and hopes and promises that felt too fragile to voice. "I'll call you tonight," Jake said as he loaded his bag into the rental car. "Let you know how the meetings go." "Okay," Kira replied, but her smile was tight around the edges. "Kira," Jake said, capturing her hands in his. "This isn't goodbye. This is just postponement." "I know," she said, but Jake could see the doubt she was trying to hide. Be careful, okay? Don't let them convince you to be someone you're not. The person I am now, the person I've become here with you. That's not going to change," Jake promised. "Whatever happens in Nashville, whatever they offer or demand or threaten, I'm coming back to this. To you." Kira nodded, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I love you," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I love you too," Jake replied, and kissed her with all the desperate longing of someone leaving paradise for purgatory. As he drove away from Cedar Falls, watching the town disappear in his rearview mirror, Jake Ross had no idea that the industry machinery was already in motion to separate him from everything he'd found. He didn't know that Gloria Ramirez had discovered his location through private investigators, or that she'd already formed plans to use Kira as leverage in negotiations. He didn't know that Derek Walsh's media campaign was only the beginning of a coordinated effort to destroy his reputation unless he returned to the industry on terms that would make authentic artistry impossible. All Jake knew was that for the first time in his life, he had something worth fighting for that had nothing to do with fame or money or critical acclaim. And as Nashville's skyline appeared on the horizon, he promised himself that whatever happened next, he would find a way back to the woman who had taught him that the most beautiful music was the kind that nobody else ever had to hear. Chapter 5 Nashville felt like a foreign country after 3 weeks in Cedar Falls. The familiar skyline looked the same, but Jake found himself noticing things that had never bothered him before: the calculated perfection of the entertainment district, the way every storefront seemed designed to sell dreams rather than serve community, the hollow glamour of a city built on the commodification of authentic emotion. His penthouse apartment was exactly as he'd left it, pristine and cold and utterly devoid of the warmth that had defined Kira's small space above the hardware store. Standing in his living room, surrounded by gold records and industry awards, Jake felt like a stranger in his own life. The first meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. at Harmony Records, the label that had been his home for 8 years and the source of most of his commercial success. Jake arrived early, partly from nervous energy and partly because Manny had insisted that punctuality would send the right message about his renewed commitment to his career. Gloria Ramirez was waiting in the executive conference room, along with the label's head of legal, their publicity director, and 2 junior executives whose presence seemed designed to emphasize the seriousness of the situation. Gloria herself was exactly what Jake remembered. Sharp, intelligent, stylishly intimidating, and utterly focused on the bottom line. "Jake," she said, standing to greet him with the kind of professional warmth that conveyed strategic interest rather than personal affection. "You look good. Rested. Whatever you've been doing during your hiatus seems to have agreed with you." "Thank you," Jake replied carefully, settling into the chair across from her. "Manny said there were some developments I needed to know about." "Several developments," Gloria confirmed, sliding a tablet across the table. "Derek Walsh's claims have gained more traction than we anticipated. 3 major music blogs have picked up his story, and social media is starting to turn against you. The narrative is becoming that you're a privileged artist who steals from collaborators and then disappears when confronted." Jake scrolled through the articles on the tablet, his stomach sinking with each headline. Rising star exposes Jake Ross's creative theft. Where is Jake Ross hiding? The dark side of celebrity collaboration. Derek had been busy, painting himself as the victim and Jake as the villain with the kind of media savvy that suggested professional guidance. "This is all lies," Jake said quietly. "Derek is the one who stole my music. I have documentation proving that Silent Echoes and 3 other songs were written by me before he ever claimed credit." "We know that," Gloria said smoothly. "But documentation doesn't matter if public opinion has already shifted. What matters now is controlling the narrative and rebuilding your brand." Jake's attention caught on her phrasing. "Rebuilding my brand? I thought this meeting was about defending my reputation." "They're the same thing," the publicity director interjected. "In today's industry, reputation and brand are inseparable. We need to remind people why they fell in love with Jake Ross in the first place, which means getting you back in the studio, back on stage, back in the public eye." "I'm willing to defend myself publicly," Jake said. "But I'm not interested in returning to the kind of manufactured authenticity that defined my career before." Gloria leaned forward, her expression sharpening with interest. "What exactly does that mean?" Jake realized he was at a crossroads that would define not just his immediate future but the entire trajectory of his artistic life. He could play the industry game, accept their guidance and return to commercial success, or he could fight for the kind of authentic artistry that his time with Kira had reminded him was possible. It means I want to make music that matters, not just music that sells, Jake said carefully. I want to work with artists who share that vision, create songs that come from genuine emotion rather than market research. That's a luxury you can afford once your reputation is rehabilitated, Gloria said. Right now, you need commercial success to prove that Derek's accusations haven't destroyed your viability as an artist. The legal director cleared his throat. There's another issue we need to discuss. Derek's team has been digging into your recent activities, looking for anything they can use to support their narrative. They've discovered your extended stay in Cedar Falls, Georgia. Jake's blood ran cold. What about it? They're claiming it proves you've been hiding from professional obligations, that you abandoned your commitments to pursue personal interests at the expense of your career. The lawyer consulted his notes. They've also found evidence of your association with a local musician named Kira Bailey. The mention of Kira's name in this sterile conference room felt like desecration. Jake's hands clenched involuntarily, protective fury rising in his chest. Ms. Bailey has nothing to do with this, Jake said tightly. She's a private citizen with no connection to the music industry. Actually, Gloria said, producing another tablet, she's quite talented. We've seen some amateur recordings of her performances. Rough, certainly, but with real potential. The kind of authentic, rootsy sound that's very marketable right now. Jake stared at the screen, seeing grainy phone videos of Kira performing at Murphy's Bar, at a local church fundraiser, at what looked like a backyard barbecue. Someone had been watching her, recording her, treating her art like a commodity to be evaluated and exploited. How did you get these? Jake asked, his voice dangerous. Social media makes everyone a talent scout, Gloria replied casually. Small-town musicians with real ability don't stay hidden long, especially when they're associated with established artists. She's not associated with me professionally, Jake said. He stopped, realizing that any description of their relationship would only give Derek's team more ammunition. She's what? Gloria asked, and Jake could see the calculation in her eyes. A friend? A collaborator? Something more personal? Before Jake could answer, Manny leaned forward with the expression of someone who had just connected several troubling dots. Gloria, what are you suggesting? Manny asked. I'm suggesting we turn a potential weakness into a strength, Gloria said smoothly. Derek is painting Jake as an isolated, arrogant artist who steals from others. But what if we counter with a story about artistic collaboration, about an established musician discovering and nurturing raw talent, about the kind of authentic creative partnership that produces extraordinary music? Jake felt sick as he realized where this was heading. You want to use Kira. I want to sign Kira, Gloria corrected. To a development deal that pairs her with you for an album of original material. We market it as a return to your roots, a collaboration that showcases both your established artistry and her fresh perspective. It rehabilitates your image while launching her career. And if I refuse? Gloria's expression hardened slightly. Then Derek's narrative becomes the accepted truth, your career ends in scandal, and Ms. Bailey remains a small-town musician whose greatest achievement is performing at local bars. The threat was elegant and devastating. Accept their terms and watch Kira be consumed by the same industry machinery that had nearly destroyed him, or refuse and watch both their dreams die in the crossfire of his reputation war with Derek. I need time to think, Jake said. You have until tomorrow morning, Gloria replied. Derek's team is planning another media push this weekend. If we're going to counter it effectively, we need to move fast. After the meeting, Jake found himself walking aimlessly through downtown Nashville, trying to process the impossible choice he'd been given. The city that had once felt like home now seemed hostile, filled with reminders of everything he'd hated about his former life. His phone rang as he passed the Ryman Auditorium, Kira's number bringing a mixture of relief and anguish. How did it go? She asked without preamble. Complicated, Jake said, stopping on the sidewalk as pedestrians flowed around him. "Kira, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it." He told her everything: Derek's media campaign, Gloria's proposition, the videos they'd somehow obtained of her performances. With each detail, Jake could hear Kira's breathing change, could sense her growing understanding of how thoroughly their private world had been invaded. "They want to sign me?" she asked when he finished. "They want to use you," Jake corrected. "There's a difference. This wouldn't be about developing your artistry or supporting your vision. This would be about packaging you as part of my rehabilitation narrative." Kira was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could picture her in her small apartment, processing the sudden transformation of her simple life into industry complications. "What do you want to do?" she asked finally. "I want to tell them to go to hell," Jake said honestly. "I want to walk away from all of it and come home to you and never deal with any of this again. But they're right about one thing: if I don't fight Derek's accusations, if I let his version become the accepted truth, then I'll never be able to create music professionally again. And you'll never get the opportunities you deserve." "Jake," Kira said softly, "opportunities one deserve aren't the same as opportunities that come at the cost of everything we've built." "What if they don't have to be mutually exclusive?" Jake found himself saying. "What if we could find a way to work within their system while protecting what matters to us?" "How?" Jake realized he didn't have an answer to that question. How did you maintain authenticity within an industry built on artifice? How did you protect genuine love from becoming marketing strategy? "I don't know," he admitted. "But Kira, seeing those videos of you performing, you're extraordinary. You deserve stages bigger than Murphy's Bar, audiences who can appreciate what you do. Maybe this is the chance for that to happen." "At what cost?" Kira asked. "Jake, I've watched what the music industry did to you, the isolation, the betrayal, the way it almost destroyed your relationship with your own creativity. Why would I want to sign up for that?" "Because maybe it doesn't have to be that way," Jake said, though he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. "Maybe with the right support, the right guidance, you could navigate it differently." "The right support," Kira repeated. "You mean you?" "I mean us. As partners, as collaborators, as whatever we need to be to protect each other while pursuing what we both love." The silence stretched between them, full of everything neither wanted to acknowledge. They were talking about fundamentally changing their relationship, about transforming intimate artistic collaboration into professional obligation, about allowing the industry that had nearly broken Jake to have access to the woman who had healed him. "I need to think about this," Kira said finally. "I know. I'm sorry, Kira. I'm so sorry that my problems have become your problems." "They became my problems the moment I fell in love with you," she said simply. "But Jake, whatever we decide, whatever we do, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that we won't let them change who we are to each other. Promise me that no matter what contracts we sign or what publicity they demand, what we have together stays ours." "I promise," Jake said, though he wondered even as he spoke whether such a promise was possible to keep. That night, Jake lay in his expensive bed in his empty apartment, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine a future that protected both his career and his heart. The industry meeting had reminded him of everything he'd hated about his former life, but it had also clarified something important: he wasn't willing to give up music entirely, wasn't willing to let Derek's lies stand unchallenged. But the cost of fighting was becoming clear. It would require sacrificing the simplicity he'd found with Kira, exposing their private world to public scrutiny, and trusting an industry that had already betrayed him once to handle their love story with care. The next morning brought a call from Manny with news that changed everything. "Kira Bailey called me directly," Manny said without preamble. "She wants to meet with Gloria today. Alone." Jake's stomach dropped. "What?" "She said she needs to understand exactly what they're proposing before she can make a decision. She's flying to Nashville this afternoon." Manny, I should be there, she specifically requested that you not be present. Said she needs to hear their pitch without worrying about how it affects you. Jake closed his eyes, recognizing Kira's protective instincts and loving her for them even as he feared what they might lead her to decide. Set up the meeting, he said finally. But Manny? Make sure she understands what she's walking into. Make sure she knows that whatever they promise, they'll want to own her completely. 6 hours later, Kira Bailey walked into the same conference room where Jake had been presented with impossible choices the day before. But unlike Jake, she came prepared with questions that cut straight through industry rhetoric to the heart of what mattered. And in that sterile corporate environment, surrounded by executives who saw her as a solution to their Jake Ross problem, Kira was about to make a decision that would transform not just her own life, but the entire trajectory of their love story. Because sometimes the most authentic thing you can do is refuse to let authenticity be defined by anyone else's terms. And sometimes the greatest act of love is protecting someone's dreams even when they conflict with your own. The meeting that would determine their future was about to begin, and neither Jake nor Kira had any idea that the real test of their connection wasn't whether they could survive industry pressure, but whether they could maintain their artistic souls while navigating a system designed to consume them. In a recording studio across town, empty and waiting, the perfect acoustics held space for the conversation that would either save their love or transform it into something unrecognizable. And in the silence between heartbeats, between one future and another, Jake Ross and Kira Bailey were about to discover that the most beautiful harmonies sometimes emerged from the most impossible circumstances. Chapter 6. The recording studio at midnight felt like a cathedral dedicated to broken dreams. Kira sat alone in the dimmed control room, surrounded by thousands of dollars worth of equipment that couldn't help her create the one thing that mattered, authentic music that honored both her artistic vision and her love for Jake. The meeting with Gloria had gone exactly as Jake had warned it would. Professional smiles masking calculated exploitation, contract terms that sounded generous until you read the fine print, promises of artistic freedom that came with so many conditions they were meaningless. They wanted to market her as Jake's discovery, his redemption story, his proof that he could recognize and nurture talent rather than steal it. But what had broken Kira's heart wasn't the industry machinery, she'd expected that. What had broken her heart was the realization that accepting their offer might be the only way to save Jake's career, and refusing it might be the only way to save their love. The studio door opened quietly, and Jake appeared in the doorway, looking haggard and uncertain. Manny told me you'd be here, he said softly. How did the meeting go? Kira turned in her chair to face him, seeing the man she loved framed by the doorway like a question mark. About as well as you'd expect. They want to own me completely, package me as your salvation narrative, and turn our love story into a marketing campaign. Jake stepped into the studio, closing the door behind him. And what did you tell them? That I needed time to think. That I needed to talk to you. Kira gestured to the empty studio around them. That I needed to sing in a space that was built for music instead of manipulation, to see if I could still feel authentic in an industry environment. And can you? Kira looked around the studio, at the pristine mixing board, the perfectly positioned microphones, the isolation booth designed to capture every nuance of vocal performance. It was beautiful and sterile and completely unlike the warm, imperfect spaces where she'd always felt most connected to her music. I don't know, she admitted. Everything feels different here. Calculated. Like the room itself is judging whether my songs are commercial enough to matter. Jake moved closer, settling onto the couch beside her chair. What if we changed that? What if we made this space about something other than industry expectations? How? By finishing what we started in Matt's garage. By completing the song we were writing together before all this industry noise got in the way. Jake gestured toward the guitars resting in stands across the room. By remembering why we fell in love with music, and each other, in the first place. Kira felt something stir in her chest, some echo of the creative excitement that had defined their early collaboration. You think that would help? I think, Jake said carefully, that if we're going to make decisions about our future, we should make them as the people we actually are, not the people the industry wants us to become. The logic was sound, but Kira could see the deeper need in Jake's eyes. He was asking for something more than a songwriting session. He was asking for a return to authenticity, for proof that their creative connection could survive industry pressure. Okay, Kira said, standing and moving toward the guitars. But we do this our way. No thinking about what Gloria or Derek or anyone else would want. Just us, just the music. Jake's relief was visible as he selected his own guitar. Just us, he agreed. They settled onto stools facing each other in the center of the studio, guitars balanced across their laps, the expensive equipment around them fading into irrelevance. For a moment, neither spoke, both adjusting to the strangeness of being together in this sterile environment after the warmth of their small-town collaboration. Where were we? Kira asked softly. The bridge, Jake replied, his fingers finding the chords they'd been working on weeks ago. The part where the song builds to something bigger. As Jake played the progression they'd developed, Kira felt the familiar magic beginning to happen. Her voice found the melody automatically, muscle memory and emotional connection stronger than industry anxiety. But something was different this time. The song that had once been about finding shelter in storms was transforming into something more complex. A meditation on choice, on the cost of authenticity, on the way love sometimes required sacrificing the very things that brought you together in the first place. What if, Kira sang softly, improvising lyrics over Jake's guitar work, what if the shelter becomes the storm? What if the safe place demands we lose ourselves to keep it? Jake's playing shifted, following her emotional lead with the kind of intuitive response that had made their collaboration feel magical from the beginning. What if choosing love means choosing loss, he added, his voice harmonizing with hers. What if the price of staying true is higher than we can pay? The questions hung in the air between them, more than lyrics, they were the fears that had been haunting both of them since the industry had invaded their private world. Jake, Kira said, setting down her guitar abruptly. We need to talk about what's really happening here. What do you mean? I mean this, she gestured between them, encompassing the guitars, the studio, the impossible situation they'd found themselves in. We're sitting in a recording studio at midnight, trying to write our way out of a problem that music can't solve. We're letting the industry force us into choices that shouldn't have to be choices. Jake set down his own guitar, giving her his full attention. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe the real question isn't whether I should sign with Gloria or whether you should fight Derek publicly. Maybe the real question is whether we're brave enough to define success on our own terms. Kira, no, listen, she interrupted, moving closer to him. What if we said no to all of it? What if you released a statement acknowledging Derek's theft, refused to engage in their media war, and walked away from an industry that's already proven it doesn't value authentic artistry? Jake stared at her, seeing the fierce determination in her eyes. You're talking about giving up everything I've worked for my entire adult life. I'm talking about choosing the life that actually makes you happy, Kira corrected. When was the last time your music career brought you joy instead of stress? When was the last time industry success felt like victory instead of compromise? The questions hit Jake like physical blows because they forced him to confront truths he'd been avoiding. His career had become a source of anxiety and betrayal rather than fulfillment. His artistic identity had been so compromised by commercial considerations that he'd lost touch with why he'd started creating music in the first place. But if I walk away, Jake said quietly, if I let Derek's lies stand, then I can never work in the industry again. I'll be blacklisted, my songs will disappear from radio, my artistic legacy will be defined by theft accusations I didn't fight. Your artistic legacy will be defined by the music you actually created, Kira said firmly. By the people whose lives were touched by your songs, by the authenticity you brought to your work before the industry corrupted it. Derek can steal your commercial success, but he can't steal the impact your music had on real people. Jake felt something shift in his chest, some long-held assumption about success and meaning beginning to crack. What about you? What about your dreams of performing for larger audiences, of developing your talent professionally? Kira smiled, and for the first time since arriving in Nashville, it reached her eyes. My dreams aren't about industry success, Jake. My dreams are about creating music that matters, connecting with people through authentic emotion, using my voice to make the world a little more beautiful. I can do that in Cedar Falls just as well as I can do it here. But the opportunities will still exist, Kira said. Maybe not through major labels or corporate machinery, but through real connections with real people. We could start our own label, support authentic artists who've been overlooked by the industry, create music on our own terms. The vision she was painting was both terrifying and intoxicating, a complete rejection of conventional success in favor of artistic integrity and personal happiness. It would mean financial uncertainty, professional obscurity, the death of Jake's celebrity status and everything that came with it. It would also mean freedom. You're talking about starting over completely, Jake said. I'm talking about starting over together, Kira corrected. Building something that belongs to us instead of adapting ourselves to fit systems that were designed to exploit us. Jake stood abruptly, pacing to the studio window that looked out over Nashville's glittering downtown. The city that had once represented all his professional ambitions now looked like a beautiful trap, full of lights that promised everything and delivered very little of lasting value. What would we do for money? He asked practically. I have savings, but not enough to fund a new label or support both our families indefinitely. We'd figure it out, Kira said simply. I'd keep working at the diner until our music generated enough income. You could teach, maybe, or do session work for independent artists. We'd live simply, build slowly, prioritize sustainability over rapid growth. And Melody? Her college plans, her future opportunities? Melody would have something more valuable than tuition money, Kira said. She'd have parents who chose authenticity over compromise, who built a life based on love and artistic integrity. She'd learn that success doesn't have to come at the cost of your soul. Jake turned back to face Kira, seeing her clearly in the studio's soft lighting. She was offering him something he'd never dared to dream of, a way out of the industry that had nearly destroyed him, a path toward a life that prioritized relationship and authentic creativity over commercial achievement. But accepting her offer would mean more than changing careers. It would mean trusting that love was strong enough to sustain them through uncertainty, that their creative partnership could flourish outside the validation of industry success. You'd really do that? Jake asked quietly. You'd really walk away from everything Gloria offered, everything the industry could give you, to build something uncertain with me? Jake, Kira said, standing and moving to face him directly, I didn't fall in love with your career. I fell in love with you. The real you, the person who exists when the cameras stop rolling and the contracts are set aside. That person doesn't need industry validation to be extraordinary. The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Jake felt 18 months of industry trauma beginning to heal in the warmth of Kira's unwavering support, felt the possibility of authentic happiness opening up like sunrise after the longest night. What if I told you, Jake said softly, that walking away from all of this feels more like victory than fighting Derek ever could? Then I'd say you're finally ready to win the only battle that really matters, the one for your own soul. Jake reached for Kira then, pulling her close in the middle of the sterile studio, surrounded by equipment designed to capture commercial perfection. But what they'd captured together was something no machine could record. The sound of two people choosing love over fear, authenticity over success, each other over everything else the world offered. When they kissed this time, it was different from every kiss that had come before. This was the kiss of two people making a mutual decision to leap together into uncertainty, to trust that their love was strong enough to create a new definition of success. So we're really doing this? Kira whispered against his lips. We're really walking away from everything the industry offers? "We're not walking away from anything that matters," Jake replied. "We're walking toward everything that does." And in that moment, in a Nashville recording studio at midnight, surrounded by the tools of an industry they were about to reject, Jake Ross and Kira Bailey finally found their perfect harmony. Not in music, but in the simple, revolutionary act of choosing each other over everything else the world told them they should want. The song they'd been trying to write suddenly completed itself in their minds, not with words or melody but with understanding. Sometimes the most authentic thing you could do was refuse to play by rules that demanded you sacrifice your soul for success. Sometimes the most beautiful music was the sound of two people saying no to everything that would diminish them, and yes to everything that would help them grow. Tomorrow, they would face Gloria and Derek and Manny and all the industry forces aligned to control their choices. Tomorrow, they would announce their decision to forge a new path that prioritized artistic integrity over commercial success. But tonight, they held each other in the silence of expensive equipment they no longer needed, and discovered that the most perfect recording was the one that existed only in their hearts, the sound of love choosing itself over everything else, again and again, for the rest of their lives. Chapter 7 The next morning brought clarity that cut through months of industry manipulation like sunlight through storm clouds. Jake and Kira sat across from Gloria Ramirez in the same conference room where impossible choices had been presented just 2 days before, but everything had changed. They were no longer supplicants hoping for industry approval, they were artists with a vision that didn't require external validation. "Thank you for meeting with us again," Jake said, his voice steady with the confidence that came from knowing exactly what he wanted. "We've made our decision." Gloria leaned forward, her expression expectant. "And?" "We're declining your offer," Kira said simply. "All of it. The recording contract, the marketing campaign, the rehabilitation strategy. We're choosing a different path." The silence that followed was thick with Gloria's disbelief. She'd clearly expected negotiation, compromise, the kind of industry maneuvering that eventually led to deals favorable to the label. "I'm not sure you understand the implications of that choice," Gloria said carefully. "Without our support, Jake's career effectively ends. Derek's narrative becomes the accepted truth, and his professional reputation remains destroyed." "His professional reputation was already destroyed the moment Derek betrayed him," Kira replied. "What we're protecting now is his artistic integrity." Jake watched Gloria process this unexpected resistance, seeing the moment when her practiced charm gave way to genuine frustration. "Ms. Bailey," Gloria said, "you're making a decision that will impact not just your own future, but your daughter's. The opportunities we're offering could secure her education, her stability, her access to experiences you could never provide as a small-town waitress." The words were designed to wound, to exploit Kira's deepest fears about whether she was enough for her child. But instead of crumbling, Kira straightened in her chair with the dignity of someone who knew her own worth. "My daughter will have something more valuable than financial opportunity," Kira said firmly. "She'll have parents who chose authenticity over compromise, who built a life based on love rather than commercial success. She'll learn that your value as a person isn't determined by industry validation." "Parents?" Gloria's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Ross, are you planning to relocate permanently to rural Georgia? To abandon your career entirely for domesticity?" Jake felt the familiar industry pressure to defend his masculinity, his ambition, his commitment to professional achievement above personal happiness. But looking at Kira beside him, remembering the peace he'd found in their small-town life, he realized those expectations no longer held any power over him. "I'm planning to build a life that includes both musical creation and authentic relationships," Jake said. "I'm choosing to define success by emotional fulfillment rather than commercial achievement." Gloria stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking. "You're both making an enormous mistake. The music industry doesn't offer second chances to artists who reject major label support. You'll be blacklisted, ignored, relegated to the kind of obscurity that destroys careers permanently." "Good," Jake said, surprising everyone in the room, including himself. Because the career that brought me here, the one built on industry politics and commercial considerations and relationships designed for mutual exploitation, that's not a career worth preserving. Jake, Manny said quietly, speaking for the first time since introductions. I understand you're hurt and angry, but this decision affects more than just you. There are people who depend on your success, employees, collaborators, business partners who've invested in your brand. Jake turned to face his manager, seeing genuine concern beneath the professional calculation. Manny had been more than a business representative. He'd been a friend, someone who genuinely cared about Jake's well-being even when profit margins demanded otherwise. Manny, I know this affects other people, and I'm sorry for that, Jake said. But I can't build my life around other people's financial dependence on my artistic compromise. The industry that's supposed to support creativity has become the thing that's killing it. What will you do? Manny asked. How will you support yourself, your family, your music? We'll start small, Kira said, reaching for Jake's hand. We'll work with independent artists who share our values, create music on our own terms, build something sustainable rather than something spectacular. And if it fails? If you can't generate enough income, if the independence you're seeking turns out to be just poverty with better intentions? Jake considered the question seriously. Financial failure was a real possibility, but it no longer seemed like the worst thing that could happen to them. Then we'll fail together, Jake said. Which feels infinitely preferable to succeeding alone in a system that demands we sacrifice everything we value. Gloria gathered her materials with the brisk efficiency of someone cutting her losses. This conversation is over. Mr. Ross, when you realize what you've thrown away, don't expect us to be available for reconstruction. A mess. Bailey, you've chosen artistic poverty over financial security. I hope that choice feels as noble in 5 years as it does today. After the executives left, Jake and Kira sat alone in the conference room, processing the finality of what they'd just done. Any regrets? Jake asked. Only that it took us this long to choose what we actually wanted, Kira replied. That afternoon, Jake made 2 phone calls that would define his public exit from the industry machinery. The first was to Derek Walsh. Jake, Derek's voice carried surprise and a note of wariness. I heard you were back in Nashville. Ready to discuss terms? Ready to tell you exactly what I think of your lies, Jake said calmly. But not in the way you expect. What does that mean? It means I'm not going to dignify your theft with a public fight. I'm not going to engage in the media circus you've created or legitimize your claims by defending against them. Jake's voice was steady, carrying the calm that came from moral certainty. I'm simply going to release a statement acknowledging what happened, then move on to creating music that actually matters. You can't just walk away, Derek said, panic creeping into his voice. You have contracts, obligations, a career to protect. I have a life to build, Jake corrected. And it doesn't include you. The second call was to a music journalist Jake trusted. Someone who'd always prioritized artistic integrity over industry politics, who would understand why Jake was choosing authenticity over reputation management. I want to give you an exclusive, Jake said. The real story behind my hiatus, Derek's theft, and why I'm choosing to walk away from major label music permanently. The interview that resulted was unlike anything Jake had ever done professionally. Instead of careful messaging designed to protect his commercial interests, he spoke with complete honesty about industry betrayal, authentic artistry, and the difference between commercial success and meaningful achievement. He talked about finding love in a small town, about remembering why music mattered, about choosing creative partnership over competitive isolation. He acknowledged Derek's theft without anger, discussed the industry's exploitation without bitterness, and described his plans for independent artistry without apology. The piece, when it appeared online later that week, created exactly the kind of industry controversy Jake had once feared. Some called him naive, others labeled him a quitter, many dismissed his rejection of commercial success as the kind of privilege only established artists could afford. But the response from actual musicians, independent artists, singer-songwriters, anyone who'd struggled to maintain authenticity within commercial pressures, was overwhelmingly supportive. Jake's public rejection of industry exploitation became a rallying cry for artists who'd felt trapped by systems that prioritized profit over creativity. More importantly, by the time the article appeared, Jake and Kira were already back in Cedar Falls, beginning the practical work of building the life they'd chosen. Matt's garage became their unofficial headquarters, the makeshift studio expanding to accommodate serious recording equipment purchased with Jake's savings. But unlike the sterile perfection of Nashville studios, this space retained the warmth and authenticity that had made their early collaboration feel magical. "It's not about having the most expensive equipment," Jake explained to Melody as they set up microphones for a recording session. "It's about creating a space where authentic emotion can be captured." Melody, who'd embraced Jake's presence in their lives with the pragmatic acceptance of teenagers everywhere, nodded seriously. "Like how mom's best singing happens when she's doing dishes, not when she's trying to perform." "Exactly like that," Jake said, struck by the teenagers' intuitive understanding of authentic creativity. Their first project was completing the album they'd started together. 10 songs that told the story of their relationship while exploring universal themes of loss, love, second chances, and the courage required to choose authenticity over convenience. They recorded during evenings and weekends, fitting studio time around Kira's diner shifts and Melody's school schedule. The process was slow, organic, completely unlike the pressured efficiency of commercial recording sessions. "Listen to this," Kira said one evening, playing back a rough mix of the song they'd been working on the night they decided to leave Nashville together. "Do you hear how much more honest it sounds than anything we could have created in Gloria's studio?" Jake listened to their voices blending over his guitar work, surrounded by the ambient sounds of small-town life filtering through the garage windows. The recording was technically imperfect but emotionally flawless, carrying the kind of authenticity that no amount of professional production could manufacture. "It sounds like us," Jake said simply. Word of their project spread through Cedar Falls with the speed that only small-town news could achieve. What surprised Jake was how quickly the community embraced not just their music but their vision of independent artistry. Tessa offered the diner as a venue for small concerts. The local bookstore wanted to host listening parties. The high school music teacher asked if they'd consider conducting workshops for students interested in songwriting. "You know what's happening here?" Matt said one evening as they cleaned up after an impromptu acoustic session for about 20 locals who'd gathered in the garage. "You're building the kind of artistic community that most musicians dream about but never find." Jake looked around at the faces that had become familiar over the months, farmers who quoted his lyrics, teachers who hummed Kira's melodies, teenagers who saw their authentic collaboration as proof that artistic integrity was possible. "We're not building it," Jake realized. "It was already here. We just chose to be part of it instead of apart from it." 6 months after their return to Cedar Falls, Jake and Kira were invited to perform at the county's annual summer festival. A 3-day celebration that drew visitors from across Georgia and beyond. It would be their first public performance as a duo, their first chance to share their completed album with an audience larger than garage gatherings. "Are you nervous?" Kira asked the morning of their performance, adjusting the guitar strap that had become as familiar as breathing. "Terrified," Jake admitted. "But for different reasons than I used to be. I'm not worried about critics or commercial success or industry approval. I'm worried about honoring what we've built, about doing justice to the community that supported us. That's the difference between performing for strangers and sharing music with family," Kira said, looking out at the festival crowd that was already gathering despite the early hour. When they took the stage that evening, as the sun set over the small-town fairgrounds and string lights created warmth against the gathering darkness, Jake felt something he'd never experienced during years of professional performance. Peace. The crowd was a mixture of locals who'd been following their journey and visitors drawn by word-of-mouth buzz about the former Nashville star who'd chosen small-town authenticity over commercial success. But rather than feeling pressure to prove himself, Jake felt embraced by the collective goodwill of people who'd gathered to hear stories told through song. "Thank you for being here," Kira said into the microphone, her voice carrying easily across the expectant crowd. "What we're sharing tonight isn't just music. It's the story of what becomes possible when you choose love over fear, authenticity over approval, each other over everything else the world tells you should matter more." They opened with "Silent Echoes," the song that had brought them together, now transformed by their collaboration into something that honored both grief and healing, loss and love found. Jake's guitar work had evolved to complement Kira's voice perfectly, while her interpretation had deepened with the emotional growth their relationship had fostered. The audience response was immediate and profound. These weren't industry professionals calculating commercial potential. These were real people connecting with authentic emotion, recognizing their own experiences of loss and hope reflected in the music. As they moved through their set, Jake realized something extraordinary was happening. The formal distance between performers and audience was dissolving into something more like community gathering, more like shared storytelling than entertainment consumption. "This next song," Jake said during a quiet moment between numbers, "is about storms. Not just weather, but everything that disrupts our plans and forces us to find shelter in unexpected places. Sometimes the most beautiful thing that can happen to you is being trapped somewhere with the right person." They performed the song they'd been writing the night of the storm, the bridge they'd completed in the Nashville studio, the verses that had emerged during late-night garage sessions surrounded by the warmth of their chosen family. But it was the final song of their set that created the evening's most powerful moment. A new composition they'd never performed publicly, written specifically for this community that had embraced their vision of authentic artistry. "This is for everyone who's ever been told their dreams were too small, their ambitions insufficient, their definition of success inadequate," Kira said, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "This is for choosing the life that makes you happy instead of the life that impresses other people." The song that followed was anthem and lullaby combined, celebration and prayer, a musical testament to the revolutionary act of defining success on your own terms. Their voices blended in harmonies that seemed to rise from their deepest connection, supported by guitar work that was both technically sophisticated and emotionally direct. When the last note faded into the summer night, the silence that followed was pregnant with recognition. This wasn't just entertainment, this was affirmation, permission, proof that authentic happiness was possible if you were brave enough to choose it. The applause that finally came was warm and sustained, but more importantly, it felt like welcome. Like home. Like the sound of community embracing two artists who'd chosen belonging over achievement, love over success, each other over everything else. Later, as they packed up their equipment while festival-goers continued to approach with stories of how the music had moved them, Jake realized that this was what he'd been searching for his entire career without knowing it. Not fame or critical acclaim or commercial success, but the simple, profound satisfaction of creating music that mattered to real people living real lives. The recognition that authentic artistry wasn't about reaching the largest possible audience, but about genuinely connecting with whatever audience chose to listen. "So," Kira said as they loaded their guitars into Matt's truck for the short drive home, "any regrets about walking away from Nashville glory?" Jake looked back at the festival stage where they'd just shared their truth with hundreds of people who'd received it with open hearts, then at the woman whose courage had made this new life possible. "Only that it took me so long to realize that this was always what I actually wanted," he said. As they drove through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, past the diner where their love story had unfolded over coffee and conversation, past the garage where they'd found their musical harmony, past the small apartments and family homes that housed the community that had become their foundation, Jake Ross understood that he'd finally found his perfect harmony. Not in music, though their songs had never been more beautiful. Not in career success, though their independent artistry was more fulfilling than commercial achievement had ever been. But in the simple, revolutionary choice to build a life based on authentic love, creative integrity, and the understanding that the most valuable things in existence couldn't be bought, sold, or manufactured by industry machinery. They'd found their harmony in each other, and in doing so, they'd discovered that the most beautiful music was the sound of two people choosing truth over convenience, love over fear, their authentic selves over anyone else's definition of who they should be. Tomorrow would bring new songs to write, new challenges to navigate, new opportunities to support other artists seeking authentic expression outside commercial constraints. But tonight, driving through their small town under a canopy of stars, Jake and Kira Bailey had everything they'd ever truly needed. They had each other, they had their music, and they had the profound peace that came from knowing they'd chosen correctly when choosing love had required them to choose against everything else the world insisted should matter more. Chapter 8. 1 year later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the small house Jake and Kira had bought together on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, a modest place with a wraparound porch, a garden where Kira grew herbs for the diner, and a converted barn that had become their professional recording studio. Jake woke to the sound of Kira's voice drifting from the kitchen, humming a melody they'd been working on the night before while she made coffee. Melody's laughter echoed from the living room where she was video calling with college friends about her freshman year at the state university, her tuition covered by a scholarship fund Jake and Kira had established for small-town students pursuing music education. Their independent label, Harmony Hollow Records, had grown from a dream into a thriving reality. What had started as a platform for their own authentic artistry had become a haven for musicians seeking creative freedom over commercial compromise. Their roster included a folk duo from Appalachian Mountains, a blues guitarist from the Mississippi Delta, and a singer-songwriter from rural Oregon whose haunting ballads had found devoted audiences through word of mouth rather than radio play. "Morning, sleepyhead," Kira said as Jake appeared in the kitchen doorway, her smile brighter than the Georgia sunshine. "Coffee's ready, and we've got 3 emails from artists wanting to know if we're accepting new submissions." "Good problems to have," Jake replied, wrapping his arms around her from behind and breathing in the scent that had become synonymous with home. "Any word from the magazine about the feature story?" "Publishing next month," Kira said, leaning back against his chest. "They want to call it Love Over Labels, How Two Artists Chose Authenticity and Found Everything." A little dramatic, but accurate. Jake laughed, remembering how terrified they'd both been of media attention just a year ago. Now, interviews felt like opportunities to encourage other artists that independence was possible, that authentic success could be defined on their own terms. Their album, Silent Echoes, had been released independently, selling modestly but steadily to an audience that treasured its emotional honesty over commercial polish. Music critics had been divided, some dismissed it as naive, others celebrated it as a return to authentic folk artistry. But the response that mattered most had come from listeners who wrote letters describing how specific songs had helped them process grief, find courage, or believe in second chances. "Jake," Melody called from the living room, "my music theory professor wants to know if you'd consider guest lecturing about authentic collaboration versus commercial songwriting. Apparently, your industry exit strategy has become a case study." "Tell him yes," Jake called back, still amazed by how teaching had become one of his greatest joys. Sharing knowledge with young musicians who were just beginning to navigate the industry felt like the best possible use of his experience. "Mom, show him the letter," Melody added. Kira moved to the refrigerator, retrieving an envelope that had arrived the previous week. This came from a woman in Oregon whose daughter was struggling with whether to accept a major label contract that would have required her to completely change her musical style. Jake read the letter, his chest tightening with emotion as the writer described how their story had given her daughter permission to decline the contract and pursue independent artistry instead. The young musician had since connected with other like-minded artists and was building exactly the kind of authentic career that major labels insisted was impossible. 17 similar letters this month, Kira said softly. People saying our choice to walk away gave them courage to make their own authentic decisions. That's the real success, isn't it? Jake said, understanding more clearly than ever that impact mattered more than industry recognition. Not how many albums we sell, but how many people we help remember that they get to choose their own definition of meaningful life. The afternoon brought their weekly recording session with a new artist. A teenage singer-songwriter from rural Tennessee whose parents had driven 8 hours to bring her to their studio after hearing about their reputation for developing authentic talent without exploitation. The thing about harmony, Jake told the nervous girl as they prepared to record her first professional demo, is that it's not about two voices doing the same thing. It's about two different voices finding a way to make each other more beautiful. As he spoke, Jake caught Kira's eye across the studio, seeing their entire love story reflected in that musical metaphor. They hadn't succeeded by becoming more alike, but by celebrating their differences while building something together that neither could have created alone. That evening, as had become their tradition, they performed at Murphy's Bar, the same venue where their story had begun with a stolen song and an impossible recognition. But now the weekly performances felt like community gatherings, opportunities to share new music with the friends and neighbors who'd supported their unconventional journey. "Thank you for being here," Kira said to the familiar faces gathered in the small venue. "A year ago, Jake and I made a choice that looked like career suicide to everyone in the music industry. Tonight, surrounded by all of you, it feels like the smartest decision we ever made." They performed 3 new songs that night, including one they'd written specifically about the courage required to disappoint other people's expectations in order to honor your own truth. The audience response was warm and immediate, not the manufactured enthusiasm of industry showcase, but the genuine appreciation of community supporting artists they knew and loved. After the show, as they packed up their equipment and said goodnight to friends who'd become family, Jake reflected on how completely his definition of success had transformed. A year ago, success had meant industry validation, commercial achievement, critical acclaim from strangers who evaluated artistry based on market performance rather than emotional authenticity. Now, success looked like waking up beside the woman he loved, creating music that honored their truth, supporting other artists in finding their own authentic voices, and knowing that their work mattered to real people living real lives. "Any regrets?" Kira asked as they walked home under the familiar canopy of small-town stars, their hands intertwined, their guitars slung over their shoulders. "Only that we waited so long to choose what we actually wanted instead of what we thought we should want," Jake replied. Jake and Kira's story reminds us that sometimes what feels like an ending is really just the beginning of something beautiful. They found their perfect harmony not by changing who they were, but by finally becoming brave enough to be themselves completely. They discovered that the most authentic success isn't about reaching the largest possible audience, but about genuinely connecting with the people who choose to listen. I'd love to hear about your own experiences with choosing authenticity over expectations. Was there a time when you had to choose between what others wanted for you and what your heart knew was right? Maybe you walked away from a job that paid well but drained your soul, or chose love that didn't look conventional but felt absolutely true. Share your stories in the comments. They inspire every tale in our Dear Love Diaries, and they remind all of us that we're not alone in the courage it takes to live authentically. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments which moment resonated most deeply with your own experience. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story from our Diary of Love. And if you know someone who's facing their own choice between authenticity and approval, share this story with them. Sometimes we all need reminding that the life that makes us happy is more valuable than the life that impresses others.